Most people see the leather vest, the skull patch, and the thunder of a massive motorcycle engine, and they immediately make up their minds about the man wearing them. They see danger, they see trouble, they see someone to cross the street to avoid. But on a cold and stormy night at a lonely roadside diner off Highway 50 in Nevada, an elderly woman saw something very different when she walked straight toward the most intimidating biker in the room and whispered 6 desperate words that would change both their lives forever. The rain had been falling since sundown, pounding the roof of the Desert Star Diner like 1,000 small fists demanding entry. The neon sign out front, a flickering pink star with half its letters burned out, smeared into a watery blur against the black Nevada sky. Wind howled across the desert floor in long, mournful gusts that rattled the diner windows and sent tumbleweeds skidding across the empty 2-lane highway like frightened animals. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of burnt coffee and frying bacon. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting a pale yellow glow across cracked vinyl booths and a linoleum floor that had been mopped so many times its original color was anyone's guess. A jukebox in the corner sat dark and silent, unplugged years ago and never reconnected. The kind of place that existed not because anyone chose to come here, but because there was simply nowhere else to stop for 100 miles in either direction. Marcus Steele Dalton sat alone in the corner booth with his back to the wall. It was a habit carved into his bones by decades of living, the kind of life where sitting with your back exposed was an invitation for trouble. He had been riding with the Iron Reapers Motorcycle Club for over 30 years, and even longer, surviving in places where a moment of carelessness could cost you everything you had left. He was a massive man, 6'3" with shoulders like a linebacker, and hands that looked more suited for lifting engine blocks than holding the chipped ceramic coffee mug. He turned slowly between his fingers. His thick beard carried streaks of gray that told the quiet story of thousands of miles ridden under sun and wind and dust. His leather cut the vest that identified him as a full-patch member of the Iron Reapers Nomad chapter creaked softly when he shifted in the booth. The patches on the back were worn but readable. The skull with crossed pistons, the bottom rocker that read Nomad. The years of road and weather stitched into every thread. Most people who walked into the diner took one look at Marcus and decided to sit somewhere else. He did not mind. In fact, he preferred it that way, especially tonight. He had been riding since dawn, 12 hours straight from Barstow, California, heading north through the desert toward Reno for a memorial ride. Bobby Tate, a brother in the club, a man who had ridden beside Marcus through rainstorms and bar fights and long, empty highways for 15 years, had gone down on Interstate 80 the week before. A blown tire at 70 miles an hour. The bike had slid sideways and Bobby had hit a guardrail with the kind of force that left nothing for the paramedics to do but cover him with a sheet and call the coroner. He was 52 years old. He had a daughter in Fresno who barely spoke to him and an ex-wife who had stopped returning his calls a decade ago. The Iron Reapers were the only family Bobby had left, and now they were riding to say goodbye the only way they knew how. Marcus took a slow sip of his coffee. It was bitter and lukewarm, exactly the kind of coffee you expected from a place like this. He did not complain. Complaining required energy, and Marcus had very little of that left. The 12-hour ride had punished his body, his lower back ached, his knees throbbed, and his hands were stiff from gripping the handlebars through cold desert wind. But the physical pain was manageable. It was the other kind that sat heavier on his chest tonight. 3 years ago, Carol had died. His wife. His anchor. The woman who had somehow loved a man who spent half his life on 2 wheels and the other half in the kind of company that made most people lock their doors. Carol had been a school teacher in San Bernardino. Quiet, patient. The kind of woman who could look at Marcus in his leather and chains and see only the man underneath. She had fought the cancer for 18 months with the same steady grace she brought to everything else in her life. And when the end came, she went quietly holding his hand in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and dying flowers, and Marcus had felt something inside himself close like a door being shut for the last time. He had not spoken about it since. Not to his brothers in the club. Not to anyone. He simply kept riding, kept moving, kept putting miles between himself and the empty house in Barstow, where her books still sat on the nightstand and her reading glasses still rested on the kitchen counter exactly where she had left them. The diner was nearly empty. A tired truck driver slumped over a plate of eggs at the counter, his cap pulled low over his eyes, fighting a losing battle against sleep. Two college-age kids sat in a booth near the window, whispering to each other and stealing nervous glances at the massive biker in the corner every few seconds. Behind the counter, a waitress named Linda wiped down the coffee machine with the bored efficiency of someone who had worked too many graveyard shifts in too many lonely roadside diners. She had the look of a woman who had stopped being surprised by anything that walked through the door at midnight a very long time ago. Then the door chimed. The sound was bright and cheerful, completely at odds with the person who stepped inside. An elderly woman shuffled through the doorway, clutching the collar of a soaked wool coat around her thin shoulders. Rainwater dripped from her white hair onto the linoleum floor in a steady patter. She could not have been more than 5 feet tall, and her small frame trembled visibly, though whether from the cold or from something else entirely was impossible to tell at first glance. Marcus noticed her immediately. It was not her age or her size that caught his attention. It was the way she moved. Her eyes darted toward the windows, toward the parking lot outside, then swept across the interior of the diner with the frantic precision of someone who was searching for an exit or a hiding place or both. Her hands shook at her sides. Her lips were pressed together so tightly they had turned white. She was not just wet from the rain. She was terrified. Linda, the waitress, opened her mouth to greet her with the standard welcome sit, anywhere you like. But before the words left her lips, the woman was already moving. She walked quickly through the diner, her steps uneven, but determined, bypassing the empty booths near the door, ignoring the counter, and heading straight for the back of the room. Straight toward Marcus. He raised an eyebrow slightly. People did not usually walk toward him. They walked around him. They changed direction when they saw him coming. They suddenly remembered they needed to be somewhere else. That was the unspoken agreement between Marcus Dalton and the rest of the world, and it had worked well for both parties for a very long time. But the woman stopped beside his table and gripped the edge of the booth with shaking fingers, as if she needed it to stay standing. Up close, Marcus could see the full measure of her fear. Her eyes were wan and glossy, brimming with tears she was fighting desperately to hold back. Her breathing came in short, uneven bursts that fogged faintly in the air-conditioned chill of the diner. A thin scratch ran along her right cheek, fresh enough to still be pink. She leaned closer to him. Her voice was barely louder than the rain hammering the windows. "Please," she whispered, "please pretend you're my grandson." Marcus blinked. For a moment, the words did not register. He looked at the tiny woman standing beside him, white-haired, trembling, old enough to be his mother, and tried to make sense of what she had just said. "What?" he asked quietly, his deep voice rumbling like distant thunder in a small room. But before she could answer, bright headlights suddenly swept across the front windows of the diner, cutting through the rain like white knives slicing the darkness. The beams moved slowly, deliberately, as if whoever was driving was scanning the building before committing to stop. The old woman's entire body went rigid. Every muscle in her small frame locked at once, and Marcus could feel the terror radiating from her like heat from an engine. He turned his head slowly toward the glass. A black SUV had rolled into the parking lot. Its engine idled for a long moment, headlights still blazing through the rain before finally shutting off. In the sudden silence, the only sounds were the rain on the roof and the old woman's ragged breathing. She grabbed Marcus's arm with surprising strength for someone so small. Her fingers dug into the leather of his sleeve with the desperation of someone clinging to the edge of a cliff. "He's here," she whispered, panic flooding her voice like water through a cracked dam. "Please, just for a minute, please." Marcus looked down at her hand on his arm. Then he looked at her face. The fear there was not the kind you could fake. He had seen plenty of liars in his life, in bars and courtrooms, in the kind of backroad negotiations where lying was just another form of currency. He knew what performed fear looked like, and this was not it. This was the real thing. Raw, desperate, the kind of fear that came from knowing exactly what was coming through that door. The diner door chimed again. A tall man stepped inside wearing a gray suit that looked completely out of place at a roadside diner at midnight in the middle of the Nevada desert. His hair was perfectly combed despite the rain outside. Thin metal glasses rested on a sharp nose above a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same stone as his expression, smooth polished and utterly devoid of warmth. He carried himself the way certain men in expensive suits always did, with the relaxed confidence of someone who was accustomed to controlling whatever room he entered. His name was Dennis Pryor, though Marcus would not learn that until later. What Marcus noticed in that first moment was not the man's name or his suit or his carefully groomed appearance. It was the way his eyes moved. They swept across the diner, slowly, methodically cataloging every face in the room with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. The trucker at the counter, the two college kids by the window, the waitress behind the register. Then his eyes stopped, locked onto Marcus and the elderly woman standing beside him. Marcus felt her grip tighten on his arm until her knuckles went white. In that moment, a dozen calculations ran through Marcus Dalton's mind simultaneously. He did not know this woman. He did not know the man in the suit. He did not know what had happened between them or what would happen next. What he knew was this: he was tired. His body hurt. He had 800 miles of grief sitting on his shoulders, and the last thing he needed tonight was someone else's trouble. But he also knew fear. He had seen it in the eyes of men twice his size. He had felt it himself in moments he would never speak about, in places he would never return to. And the fear in this woman's eyes was the kind that came from somewhere deep and real and close to death. Marcus sighed quietly. Then he slid over in the booth and patted the worn vinyl seat beside him. "Grandma," he said loudly enough for the whole diner to hear, "I told you not to go wandering off in this weather. You're going to catch pneumonia." The old woman did not hesitate. She slipped into the booth beside him and wrapped her thin arm around his massive one, as naturally as if she had done it 1,000 times before. She leaned into his shoulder, her small body pressing against his leather vest, and for just a moment the trembling eased. "Sorry, sweetheart," she said softly, her voice still shaking but finding its rhythm. "You know how I get when I can't sleep." Across the diner floor, the man in the gray suit had stopped walking. His polite smile, the kind that never quite reached the eyes, froze on his face as he studied the scene in the back booth. The enormous biker. The tiny grandmother tucked under his arm like she belonged there. The coffee mug and the leather and the unlikely warmth between two people who by all appearances shared something private and unbreakable. Marcus lifted his coffee mug with his free hand and took a slow, deliberate sip. He held the suited man's gaze the entire time. The message was simple and did not require words. Whatever game you came here to play tonight, you are not playing it alone anymore. The suited man studied them for a long moment. Marcus watched his expression shift through a series of small, controlled adjustments: surprise, calculation, reassessment. Most normal people would have hesitated when confronted by a man of Marcus's size and appearance. The leather, the patches, the arms like steel cables. The general atmosphere of someone who had spent a lifetime in situations where violence was not a possibility, but a probability. But Dennis Pryor did not hesitate. He simply recalculated. That told Marcus something important. This man was not easily frightened, which meant he was either very stupid or very dangerous. And the suit, the glasses, the perfect composure at midnight in a rainstorm, none of it suggested stupidity. The rain continued to pound the diner windows. The neon sign outside flickered, casting brief flashes of pink light across the man's face. And in those flashes, Marcus saw something unsettling in his expression. There was no confusion, no surprise, just cold patience. The kind of patience that belonged to someone who was accustomed to getting what he wanted and was willing to wait for it. Finally, the man adjusted the cuffs of his jacket and began walking toward the booth with calm, deliberate steps. His shoes clicked softly against the linoleum. The sound was precise and measured like a metronome counting down to something inevitable. The trucker at the counter had lifted his head. The two college kids had stopped whispering. Even Linda behind the counter had set down her rag and was watching. The atmosphere inside the diner had shifted. Everyone could feel it. The air had thickened, charged with the same electric tension that preceded a desert thunderstorm. The stranger stopped beside the table and offered a polite smile that carried all the warmth of a fluorescent light. "I apologize for the interruption," he said smoothly. His voice was controlled, professional, pitched at the exact frequency of lawyers and executives and men who were accustomed to having their words treated as commands rather than requests. "But I believe there's been a misunderstanding." He gestured toward the elderly woman sitting beside Marcus. "This woman is my mother. She suffers from occasional episodes of confusion and tends to wander off when she becomes upset. I'm sure you can understand my concern." Eleanor stiffened beside Marcus. Her hand tightened around his arm until he could feel her pulse hammering through his sleeve. Marcus did not move. He leaned back in the booth, stretching one arm along the top of the seat behind Eleanor and studied the man with the same unhurried attention he would give to a snake coiled on a trail in front of him. "That's so," Marcus said slowly. The stranger nodded and reached into his pocket. For a split second, Marcus's muscles tightened, his body shifting instinctively into the kind of readiness that came from years of expecting trouble from well-dressed strangers who reached into their pockets. But the man only pulled out his phone. He tapped the screen twice, then held it up for Marcus to see. "Here," he said, "a photo." The picture showed the same elderly woman standing beside the suited man outside what looked like a large, expensive house. A manicured lawn, a circular driveway. She was smiling in the photo, wearing a clean dress and a pearl necklace. Her hair neatly styled, her posture relaxed. On the surface, it looked convincing. But Marcus had spent most of his life reading people the way other men read books, carefully between the lines, looking for what was hidden beneath the surface. And something about the photo did not sit right. The woman beside him was trembling with genuine terror. The woman in the photo looked posed, arranged, like a prop in someone else's story. Marcus lowered his gaze to the old woman and spoke quietly, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "You know this guy?" She shook her head so fast it almost looked painful. Tears gathered in the corners of her eyes and spilled down her weathered cheeks. "No," she whispered. "He works for the man who killed my husband." The words hit Marcus like a cold wind through an open door. He held her gaze for a moment, searching her eyes for any sign of deception, and found nothing but grief and fear and a desperate burning need to be believed. He slowly returned his attention to the suited man. "Funny thing," Marcus said, setting his coffee mug down on the table with a deliberate clink. "My grandma says she's never seen you before." The man's polite smile tightened. It was not anger yet, but it was the room next door. "Sir," he said, his voice still smooth but carrying a new edge beneath the surface. "I appreciate your concern, but this is a private family matter, and I would prefer to handle it without unnecessary complications." Marcus shrugged casually, a motion that made the leather of his vest creak and the chain attached to his wallet swing gently against the booth. His eyes never left the man's face. "Looks like family already, founder." The stranger's gaze hardened. The polished veneer cracked just enough for Marcus to see what lay underneath, something cold and predatory, and accustomed to getting its way through means that polite society preferred not to discuss. "You're making this more complicated than it needs to be." The man leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice. "Let the woman come with me, and you can get back to your coffee. No one needs to have a difficult evening." The old woman's grip tightened again. Marcus could feel her trembling through his sleeve, a continuous tremor that ran through her thin frame like a current. "I'm not going anywhere with him," she whispered. Marcus exhaled slowly through his nose. Then he pushed himself to his feet. The booth creaked loudly as he unfolded to his full height, rising like a mountain emerging from the earth until he towered over the suited man by nearly half a foot. The fluorescent lights above reflected off the chrome ring on his right hand and the thick steel chain that hung from his belt loop to his back pocket. For a moment, neither man spoke. The rain hammered the windows. The neon sign flickered. The entire diner held its breath. Then Marcus leaned down just slightly until their faces were level, and there was nowhere for the suited man to look except directly into Marcus's eyes. "You hear that?" Marcus said quietly. "Grandma doesn't want to go." The man studied him with narrowed eyes. The mask of politeness was gone now, discarded like a tool that had outlived its usefulness. "You have no idea who you're interfering with," he said softly. Marcus shrugged again. "Probably not." He glanced briefly out the window. Another set of headlights had just appeared in the parking lot, cutting through the rain at an angle that suggested a vehicle pulling in fast and stopping hard. A second black SUV. Marcus noticed the suited man glance toward it too, just for a split second, and that was enough to confirm what Marcus already suspected. This man had not come alone. This was not a one-car operation. Whatever was happening tonight had been planned, organized, and staffed with the kind of resources that ordinary people simply did not have. The man looked back at Marcus. A faint, confident smile returned to his face. "I'm trying to be reasonable," he said, "but you're forcing my hand." Marcus chuckled under his breath. It was a low, quiet sound, completely devoid of humor. "Buddy," he said, "you picked the wrong diner for that speech." Behind the man, the diner door opened again. Two large men stepped inside, both wearing dark jackets that did little to hide the breadth of their shoulders or the practiced stillness of their movements. They positioned themselves near the entrance without speaking, their eyes scanning the room with the flat, professional gaze of men who were paid to stand in doorways and make problems disappear. The college kids slid out of their booth immediately and hurried toward the restroom, their faces pale. The trucker slowly pushed his plate away and stood leaving a crumpled bill on the counter, clearly deciding that whatever was about to happen was not worth the price of a midnight breakfast. Linda, the waitress, froze behind the counter, her hands gripping the edge of the register, eyes wide. The suited man spread his hands slightly palms up as if presenting the situation to Marcus like a reasonable business proposition. "Last chance," he said. "Step aside." Marcus glanced down at the elderly woman still sitting in the booth. She looked up at him with the kind of helpless terror that made his jaw clench so hard his teeth ached. In her eyes he saw Carol. Not the face or the features, but something deeper. The vulnerability of someone who had no one left to turn to, no one left to stand between them and the thing they feared most. Then he looked back at the man. "Not happening." The stranger's eyes darkened. He opened his mouth to respond, but before a single word left his lips, something changed. Not in the diner. Outside. A sound. Faint at first, then growing steadily stronger. Rising through the rain and the wind like a distant heartbeat, accelerating toward a crescendo. A deep mechanical thunder that vibrated faintly through the diner's windows and made the glasses on the counter tremble in their saucers. The unmistakable roar of large V-twin engines. Dozens of them, coming from the south from the direction of the highway, growing louder with every passing second until the sound filled the diner like a living thing. The suited man had not noticed it yet. He was too focused on Marcus, too locked into the confrontation to register what was happening beyond the walls. But Marcus heard it. He recognized it the way you recognize the voice of a friend in a crowded room. And for the first time that evening, a slow smile crept across Marcus Dalton's face. Outside headlights appeared at the far end of the highway. Not one or two, but dozens cutting through the rain like a formation of glowing spears. The rumble grew until it was not just a sound, but a physical sensation, a vibration that ran through the floor and up through the soles of Marcus's boots and settled in his chest like a second heartbeat. The waitress looked toward the windows. The trucker paused at the door. Even the two enforcers near the entrance turned their heads. Within seconds, the parking lot erupted with noise as motorcycle after motorcycle roared in from the highway, their engines echoing off the diner walls as they rolled to a stop in tight practice formation. Chrome flashed under the flickering neon. Leather vests glistened with rain. 20 bikes, maybe more, filling the lot in less than 30 seconds with the kind of organized precision that came from years of riding together, living together, and looking out for each other without needing to be asked. The suited man's confident expression cracked for the first time, a hairline fracture that spread across his composure like a stone hitting a windshield. Marcus leaned slightly closer to him and spoke in a voice as calm as still water. "Those would be my friends." The diner door swung open, and the first biker stepped inside, pulling off his helmet and shaking rain from a beard that was even larger than Marcus's. He was enormous, easily 300 pounds, with tattoos covering both arms from wrist to shoulder, and the Iron Reaper's patch stitched across the back of his vest in bold white thread. His name was Big Jim Harlan, vice president of the Nevada chapter, and he had the kind of presence that made rooms feel smaller simply by being in them. Behind him, several more bikers entered, filling the small diner with a smell of wet leather and gasoline, and the unmistakable energy of men who had been riding hard through a storm and were ready for whatever came next. Big Jim scanned the room with experienced eyes, reading the situation in seconds: the suited man, the enforcers by the door, the terrified waitress, the old woman in the booth. Then he spotted Marcus. "Steele," he said with a grin that split his beard like a crack in a canyon wall. "You call for backup, or did we just happen to have perfect timing?" Marcus shrugged casually. "Grandma needed a ride." Big Jim's eyes moved toward the elderly woman still clutching the edge of the booth. His expression shifted instantly from amused to something harder and more protective. Whatever he saw in that old woman's face, the fear, the exhaustion, the desperate hope, it was enough. "Well then," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that filled the room, "looks like family business." The suited man attempted to recover. He cleared his throat and straightened his jacket, adjusting his glasses with a hand that for the first time was not entirely steady. "This situation has become unnecessarily dramatic," he said, addressing the room as if he were managing a boardroom that had gotten slightly out of hand. "We are simply here to retrieve a relative who is suffering from confusion and requires care." One of the bikers behind Big Jim laughed loudly. The sound was sharp and unmistakable in its meaning. Another cracked his knuckles slowly, the popping sounds echoing in the sudden quiet like small firecrackers. Big Jim folded his arms across his chest. The motion made his leather vest stretch tight across his massive shoulders. "Funny thing," he said slowly, looking at the old woman. "She don't look confused to me." And then she spoke. Not the whisper Marcus had heard earlier. Not the trembling, broken voice of a woman on the edge of collapse. Eleanor Graves straightened her thin shoulders, lifted her chin, and spoke in a voice that carried across the diner with a clarity and force that surprised everyone in the room, including Marcus. "They killed my husband," she said. The room went absolutely silent. Even the rain seemed to pause. "His name was Walter Graves." She continued, her voice steady now, as if speaking the truth aloud had given her a strength she did not know she still possessed. "He was an accountant. He worked for a company called Holt Development Group for 23 years. And 8 months ago, he discovered that the company had been laundering hundreds of millions of dollars through fake real estate transactions and offshore accounts." She paused. Her eyes moved from face to face, landing on each biker, each stranger, each witness in the room. "When he told them he was going to report it, they killed him. They made it look like a car accident on a mountain road. Cut the brake lines. The police called it tragic. The company called it unfortunate." Her voice cracked, but she did not stop. "I call it murder." The suited man's face had gone very still. Not angry, not frightened, something worse. Calculating. "That's enough," he said sharply. But Eleanor was not finished. "Walter knew they would come for him," she said. "So before he died, he copied everything. Every transaction, every account number, every name. He put it on a hard drive and hid it in our garage behind a box of Christmas ornaments where no one would ever think to look." She reached into the folds of her wet wool coat and pulled out a small, battered external hard drive, holding it up for the room to see. "I found it 3 months ago," she said, "and I have been running ever since." Marcus stared at the small device in her hand. Then he looked at the suited man whose eyes had locked onto the hard drive with the focused intensity of a predator tracking prey. "That is private property belonging to Holt Development Group," the man said, his voice tight and controlled, "and you have no legal right to possess it." Eleanor looked at him with an expression that was no longer afraid. It was defiant. "Your boss had no legal right to murder my husband," she said quietly. "But here we are." Big Jim unfolded his arms and stepped forward until he was standing shoulder to shoulder with Marcus, forming a wall of leather and muscle between Eleanor and the suited man. "Sounds to me," Big Jim said slowly, "like this lady needs a safe place to spend the night and an escort to wherever she's going in the morning." One of the bikers near the back pulled out his phone and dialed casually. "Yeah, I'd like to speak with someone at the Washoe County Sheriff's Office," he said in a loud, clear voice. "We've got a situation at the Desert Star Diner on Highway 50 that somebody might want to take a look at." The suited man clenched his jaw. For several long seconds, nobody in the diner moved. The rain hammered the windows. The motorcycles outside idled, their engines rumbling like caged thunder. Then Dennis Pryor took a slow step backward. "This isn't finished," he said quietly, his eyes moving from Marcus to Eleanor to Big Jim and back again, cataloging faces with the precision of a man who intended to remember every single one. Marcus tilted his head slightly. "Sure sounds like it is." Outside, the distant wail of sirens began to rise through the storm, faint at first but growing steadily closer. Through the rain, someone had already called the authorities. The two enforcers by the door exchanged a quick glance before stepping outside and disappearing into the parking lot. Dennis Pryor followed them, pausing in the doorway for one final look back at the booth where Eleanor sat. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes lingered on the hard drive in her hands for a fraction of a second too long before he turned and walked into the rain. The black SUVs pulled out of the parking lot, minutes later, their headlights fading into the storm like dying embers. Two sheriff's patrol cars arrived shortly after, their flashing red and blue lights cutting through the darkness and reflecting off the wet chrome of 20 parked motorcycles. Statements were taken. The deputy, a young man with earnest eyes and a notebook he filled with careful handwriting, listened to Eleanor's account with growing seriousness. The diner became a temporary command post, bikers standing along the walls like leather-clad sentinels, while Eleanor sat in the booth and told her story from the beginning. But something nagged at Marcus throughout the process. It was a small thing, barely noticeable, the kind of detail that most people would have missed entirely. When the first patrol car had pulled in, Sheriff Dale Crenshaw himself had arrived. Not a deputy, the sheriff. At midnight, at a roadside diner in the middle of nowhere, for what should have been on the surface a routine welfare check. Crenshaw was a thick, red-faced man in his late 50s with a handlebar mustache and the easy confidence of someone who had been the biggest authority figure in a small county for a very long time. He shook hands with Marcus, nodded at Big Jim, spoke kindly to Eleanor, and promised that his office would look into her claims thoroughly and professionally. It all looked right, every word, every gesture, every reassuring nod. But Marcus watched people the way a mechanic listened to engines. He did not just look at what was happening on the surface. He listened for the sounds that did not belong, the knock that shouldn't be there, the hesitation that didn't fit. And when Eleanor excused herself to use the restroom, steadying herself on the edge of the booth as she stood, Marcus saw it. Sheriff Crenshaw reached for his phone. It was a quick motion, practiced and smooth, the kind of thing a man did without thinking. He tapped the screen twice, typed something brief, no more than a few words, and slipped the phone back into his pocket before anyone else in the room could have noticed. But Marcus noticed. He noticed the way Crenshaw's eyes flicked toward the restroom door after he sent the message. He noticed the way the sheriff's easy smile settled back into place, a fraction of a second too late, like a mask being readjusted after slipping. And he noticed, most importantly, the brief flash of text on the screen before it went dark. Marcus could not read the entire message from across the room, but he could read the first two words clearly enough. "She's here." Marcus said nothing. He did not move. He continued to lean against the booth with his arms folded, wearing the same expression of bored indifference he always wore in situations where his mind was racing at full speed behind a wall of practiced calm. But inside, something had shifted. The calculations had changed. This was not a simple case of a frightened old woman and a suited thug in a parking lot. This was something bigger, something with roots that reached deeper than a single company and a single crime. If the local sheriff was sending messages about Eleanor's location to unknown recipients in the middle of the night, then the danger she was in extended far beyond Dennis Pryor and his black SUVs. Eleanor returned from the restroom looking slightly steadier, though her eyes were still red and her hands still trembled. She settled back into the booth beside Marcus and pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders. Crenshaw approached with a warm smile. "Ma'am, we'll have a deputy posted outside your motel tonight, if you'd like," he said. "Keep you safe and sound until we can sort this all out in the morning." Eleanor opened her mouth to accept, but Marcus spoke first. "Appreciate that, Sheriff," he said easily. "But Grandma's riding with us tonight. Already got a room booked in Reno. Family reunion, you know how it is." Crenshaw's smile held, but something behind his eyes shifted, a flicker of irritation so brief it might have been imagined. "Well, that's a long ride in this weather," the sheriff said, "especially for a lady of her age. Might be safer to stay local." "She's tougher than she looks," Marcus said. He stood and gently helped Eleanor to her feet, keeping one arm around her thin shoulders. "Come on, Grandma. Boys are waiting." Crenshaw watched them walk toward the door. His hand drifted toward his pocket again, then stopped. Too many eyes in the room. Outside, the rain had eased to a steady drizzle. The parking lot was crowded with motorcycles, their chrome catching the reflection of the patrol car lights. Big Jim was leaning against his bike, smoking a cigarette and watching the door. When Marcus emerged with Eleanor, Big Jim flicked the cigarette away and straightened up. "Change of plans," Marcus said quietly, leading Eleanor toward his Harley. "We're not staying here tonight." Big Jim read Marcus's face and did not ask questions. "How far?" "Reno, tonight." Big Jim raised an eyebrow. "That's 4 hours in this weather." "I know." Big Jim looked at Eleanor, then back at Marcus. Whatever he saw in his brother's expression was enough. "All right," Big Jim said. He turned and let out a sharp whistle that cut through the night air. Heads turned across the parking lot. "Mount up, we're riding to Reno full escort." The response was immediate. Cigarettes were extinguished. Helmets were pulled on. Engines roared to life one by one, filling the desert night with the deep mechanical thunder that had become the soundtrack of Marcus's life. Marcus helped Eleanor onto the back of his Harley, making sure she was secure, and her arms were wrapped tight around his waist. She felt impossibly light behind him, like a bird perched on a branch. "Hold on tight," he said over his shoulder. "I'm not letting go," she replied. As the convoy began to roll out of the parking lot, Marcus caught one last glimpse of Sheriff Crenshaw, standing in the diner doorway watching them leave. The sheriff's phone was already in his hand. Marcus twisted the throttle. The Harley surged forward onto the highway, and 20 motorcycles followed in tight formation behind him, their headlights cutting through the rain like a river of light flowing north through the darkness. Somewhere behind them, a message was being sent. Somewhere ahead of them, someone was waiting. And in between, on the back of a motorcycle she never expected to ride, Eleanor Graves clutched the hard drive inside her coat and held on for her life. They had been riding for 40 minutes when Eleanor's voice reached Marcus through the wind and engine noise. She had pressed herself close against his back, her thin arms locked around his torso with a grip that was stronger than her size suggested. The rain had eased to a fine mist, but the desert air at speed was bitterly cold, and Marcus could feel her shivering against him through the leather of his vest. "I need to tell you something," she said, her words carried forward by the wind. "About the hard drive, about Walter." Marcus did not turn his head. At 70 miles an hour on a wet highway at night, you kept your eyes forward and your mind on the road. But he tilted his head slightly to let her know he was listening. "Walter didn't just stumble onto those records by accident," Eleanor said. "He was a careful man, methodical. He had worked for Holt Development for 23 years, and for the first 15 he did exactly what they asked him to do. He balanced the books. He filed the reports. He signed where they told him to sign." She paused. The highway stretched empty ahead of them, a dark ribbon cutting through the desert floor. The other bikes rumbled around them in formation, their headlights creating a corridor of light. "But something changed," she continued. "In the last few years, Walter started coming home different, quiet, distracted. He would sit at the kitchen table after dinner and just stare at the wall like he was working through a problem he couldn't solve. I asked him what was wrong 100 times, and he always said the same thing. 'Nothing, Ellie, just tired.'" Her voice caught slightly, and Marcus felt her arms tighten around his waist. "He was a proud man. He didn't want me to worry, but I worried anyway because that's what you do when you've been married to someone for 50 years. You know them. You know the sound of their breathing when they're asleep and the way they hold their coffee cup when something is bothering them. And I knew something was eating Walter alive." The formation shifted slightly as the highway curved. Big Jim's bike moved up beside Marcus, riding parallel for a moment before falling back into position. "When I found the hard drive," Eleanor said, "after he died, after the funeral, after the police closed the case, and everyone told me what a terrible accident it was, I didn't even know what was on it at first. Walter had hidden it behind a box of Christmas decorations in the garage. He had wrapped it in a plastic bag and taped it to the back of the shelf where nobody would ever look." She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice carried something new. Not just grief, something harder. Something that had been forged in 8 months of fear and solitude, and the slow-burning realization that the man she had loved for half a century had been carrying a secret that had cost him his life. "I was a legal secretary for 30 years, Eleanor said. "Before I married Walter, before I retired, I worked for a law firm in Carson City. I know what financial records look like. I know the difference between a legitimate transaction and one that has been constructed to hide where the money is really going. And when I opened those files on Walter's hard drive, I knew exactly what I was looking at." Marcus felt a shift in the way she held on to him. Not weaker, stronger, as if telling the truth was feeding something inside her that the fear had been starving. "Hundreds of millions of dollars," she said, "moved through shell companies, in fake property deals, in offshore accounts in the Caymans and Switzerland. All of it flowing through Holt Development Group. All of it signed off by accountants and lawyers and executives who knew exactly what they were doing." The road opened up ahead of them, straight and flat, and stretching toward the distant glow of city lights on the horizon. "But there's one file I couldn't open," Eleanor said. "Walter encrypted it, password protected. I've tried everything I can think of, our anniversary, his birthday, my birthday, our old address. Nothing works. And I believe that file contains the most dangerous information of all. Names, not just the company executives, not just the accountants, the people above them, the politicians, the judges, the ones who made sure the investigations never went anywhere and the cases never got filed." Marcus processed this in silence. The weight of what she was describing settled over him like the desert cold, invisible but impossible to ignore. This was not a story about a single crooked company. This was a story about a system. A network of powerful people who had built a machine designed to generate money and eliminate anyone who threatened to expose it. And Eleanor Graves, 5 feet tall, 75 years old, shivering on the back of a motorcycle in the Nevada desert, was the only person left alive who could bring it all down. "Why Reno?" Marcus asked, his voice cutting through the wind. "There's an FBI field office there," Eleanor said, and a federal prosecutor I've been writing to. A woman named Patricia Stern. She's the only one I trust. I've been trying to reach her for weeks, but every time I get close to a phone or a computer, they find me. They have people everywhere. The local police, the county offices. I don't know how far it reaches. Marcus thought about Sheriff Crenshaw and the text message he had sent from the diner doorway. She's here. The reach, it seemed, extended at least that far. There's someone else, Eleanor added. A journalist, Megan Rowley. She works for a news outlet in Reno. She's been investigating Holt development for 2 years. I found her articles online before they took my computer. I managed to mail her a copy of everything on the hard drive, a USB stick in a padded envelope sent from a post office in Ely 3 weeks ago. She paused. If anything happens to me, she said quietly, if they catch me, if the hard drive gets destroyed, Megan has the backup. That was my insurance. Marcus nodded slowly into the wind. The old woman had been more careful than anyone would have guessed. Behind the fear and the trembling and the soaked wool coat, there was a mind that had been planning and calculating and preparing for exactly this moment. She was not helpless. She had never been helpless. She had simply been alone. Until tonight, the formation of motorcycles rumbled north through the desert darkness, 20 engines roaring in unison, their headlights painting the wet highway in a moving river of gold. The storm clouds were beginning to thin overhead, and through the breaks, the first faint stars appeared against the black Nevada sky. Eleanor pressed her face against Marcus's back and closed her eyes. For the first time in 8 months, she was not running alone. And Marcus Dalton, who had spent 3 years riding away from his own grief, who had climbed on his motorcycle that morning, expecting nothing more than a long, sad ride to say goodbye to a dead friend, felt something stir in his chest that he had not felt in a very long time. Purpose. The highway stretched ahead of them, long and dark and full of unknowns. But for now, the road was clear, the brothers were close, and the woman on the back of his bike was still holding on. That was enough. They reached Reno just before 4 in the morning. The city rose from the desert floor like a mirage of flickering lights and neon promises, its casinos and hotels glowing against the pre-dawn sky with the weary extravagance of a showgirl performing for an empty room. The rain had stopped an hour earlier, and the highways leading into the city were slick and gleaming under the streetlights. Marcus guided the convoy off the interstate and through the quieter streets on the south side of town, where the neon gave way to strip malls and residential blocks and the kind of economy motels that asked no questions and accepted cash. They pulled into the parking lot of the Silver Ridge Motor Lodge, a low L-shaped building with a vacancy sign that flickered intermittently, and a front office that looked like it had not been renovated since the mid-1980s. Big Jim handled the rooms. He walked into the office with the easy authority of a man who was accustomed to arranging accommodations for groups that most motels would prefer not to host, and within 5 minutes he emerged with 3 room keys. One for Eleanor, one for Marcus, one for the rotating watch that Big Jim insisted on posting outside Eleanor's door for the rest of the night. 2 brothers on the door at all times, Big Jim said, handing Marcus a key. 4-hour shifts. Nobody gets in or out without us knowing. Marcus nodded. He helped Eleanor off the bike and walked her to her room. She moved slowly, stiffly, the long ride having taken a toll on a body that was not built for 4 hours on the back of a Harley in cold desert air. But she did not complain. She held the hard drive against her chest like a mother holding a child, and when Marcus opened the door to the small, clean room and turned on the light, she stood in the doorway for a moment and simply breathed. "Thank you," she said quietly. The words were inadequate, and they both knew it, but they were all she had. Marcus scratched his beard. "Get some sleep. We'll figure out the next step in the morning." She looked up at him. In the harsh light of the motel room, the lines on her face seemed deeper, the shadows under her eyes darker. But something in her expression had changed since the diner. The terror was still there, lurking beneath the surface like a fish in dark water. But it was no longer the only thing. There was something else now, something that looked, if Marcus had to name it, like determination. "His birthday," she said suddenly. Marcus frowned. "Whose?" "The password for the encrypted file." She pressed her lips together. "I've been trying to think of what Walter would have used, what mattered to him enough to be the key to everything." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. "We had a son, David. He died when he was 4 years old. Meningitis. It was 1978. Marcus stood very still in the doorway. "Walter never talked to me about it," Eleanor continued. "Not once in 47 years. Not to me. Not to anyone. But every year on David's birthday, he would go into the garage alone and sit there for an hour. I never disturbed him. I never asked what he did in there. Her eyes glistened. Now I think I know. She looked down at the hard drive in her hands. David's birthday, October 14th, 1974. That's the password. I'm almost certain of it. Marcus felt the weight of her words settle into the room like dust after an explosion. The grief of a child lost nearly 50 years ago, still alive, still carrying weight, still shaping the decisions of a dead man who had hidden the most dangerous secret of his life behind the memory of his son. Try it in the morning, Marcus said gently. You need rest. Eleanor nodded slowly and stepped into the room. She turned back once more before closing the door. Marcus, she said, when this is over, I want you to know I didn't choose you at random in that diner. I walked toward you because you looked like the kind of man who wouldn't look away. She closed the door. Marcus stood in the hallway for a long moment, listening to the sound of the lock clicking into place, before turning and walking to his own room. He did not sleep. He lay on the narrow motel bed with his boots still on and his vest draped over the chair, staring at the water-stained ceiling and thinking about Walter Graves and encrypted files and a 4-year-old boy who had been dead for nearly half a century. He thought about Carol, too. He always thought about Carol in the quiet hours when there was nothing to distract him from the absence of her. The way she used to read in bed with her glasses pushed up on her forehead, the way she hummed while she cooked, the way she had looked at him in the hospital at the end with eyes that held no fear, only a quiet, devastating tenderness. He missed her. He would always miss her. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, the missing did not feel like drowning. It felt like something else. Like standing on the shore and watching the tide go out and knowing that the ocean was still there, vast and permanent, even if you could no longer touch it. Morning came with desert sunlight pouring through the thin motel curtains and the sound of motorcycles being started in the parking lot. Marcus splashed water on his face, pulled on his vest, and walked outside into air that was crisp and dry and smelled of sage and gasoline. Big Jim was already awake, leaning against his bike with a paper cup of coffee in one massive hand. He looked like he had slept about as well as Marcus had, which was to say not at all. We got a problem, Big Jim said without preamble. Marcus waited. Tommy Nails didn't come back from his watch shift. Marcus frowned. Tommy Nails Barker had been a member of the Iron Reapers for 6 years. He was younger than most of the club, mid-30s, lean and wiry, with a nervous energy that made him useful for certain tasks and unreliable for others. He had been part of the escort from the diner, riding near the back of the formation, and Big Jim had assigned him to the second watch shift on Eleanor's door. When was he last seen? Marcus asked. About 2 hours ago. Ricky said he stepped out for a smoke and never came back. His bike's still here. Big Jim gestured toward a black Sportster parked at the end of the row. But his saddlebags are open, and his phone's gone. Marcus said nothing for a moment. The desert sun was climbing higher, burning off the last traces of the night's rain and casting long shadows across the parking lot. He looked at Tommy's bike, then at the motel, then at the highway beyond the lot where cars were beginning to appear in the early morning traffic. Pull his jacket, Marcus said quietly. Big Jim raised an eyebrow. You sure we don't know anything yet? I know enough. Marcus turned and walked toward Eleanor's room. He knocked twice. A moment later, the door opened, and Eleanor appeared still wearing her wool coat, the hard drive clutched in both hands. She had clearly not slept either, but there was a sharpness in her eyes that had not been there the night before. Did you try the password? Marcus asked. Eleanor nodded slowly. October 14th, 1974. It worked. Marcus waited. The file contains a list, Eleanor said. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled around the hard drive. Names and amounts. Payments made to specific individuals over a period of 15 years. Politicians, law enforcement, and a federal judge. She paused. Judge Franklin Mercer, Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. He received over $2 million from Holt Development through a series of shell companies. There are bank records, wire transfers, everything. And he's not the only one. Sheriff Dale Crenshaw received $175,000 over 5 years. There are state legislators, county officials, a district attorney. Marcus exhaled through his teeth. The scope of what Eleanor was describing had just expanded from a corporate fraud case into something that reached into the foundations of the legal and political system. This isn't just about money laundering anymore, Marcus said. No, Eleanor agreed. This is about a network, a machine. Raymond Loomis built it over 20 years, and he bought every person he needed to keep it running. Walter documented all of it, every payment, every name, every date. Raymond Loomis, Marcus repeated. The name was new to him. The CEO of Holt Development Group, Eleanor said. The man who ordered my husband's death. The man Dennis Pryor works for. The man who owns, for all practical purposes, a federal judge and half the law enforcement in northern Nevada. Marcus looked out across the parking lot where the Iron Reapers were gathered, some sitting on their bikes, some standing in small groups, smoking and talking. These were hard men, men who had lived outside the law for most of their lives and understood the world in terms of loyalty and consequence. But what Eleanor was describing was a different kind of outlaw, the kind that wore suits and sat in offices and destroyed lives with signatures instead of fists. We need to get you to that FBI office, Marcus said, and we need to reach your journalist. What was her name? Megan Rowley. I have a number for her, a burner phone I bought in Ely. Call her. Set up a meeting today. Eleanor nodded and retreated into her room. Marcus turned back toward the parking lot and found Big Jim waiting. Tommy's phone, Marcus said. Has anyone tried to reach him? Goes straight to voicemail. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment. The picture was forming in his mind with the clarity of something he had suspected but not wanted to believe. Tommy Nails, young, broke, the kind of man who lived paycheck to paycheck and filled the gaps with bad decisions. Marcus remembered hearing months ago that Tommy had gotten into debt gambling, mostly the kind of hole that kept getting deeper the more you tried to climb out. Who does Tommy owe money to? Marcus asked. Big Jim was quiet for a beat. Couple of people. There was talk about a casino debt, 30, 40 grand. He said he worked it out. With who? Big Jim didn't answer immediately. He didn't need to. They both understood that in Nevada, when a man owed $40,000 to the wrong people, the debt didn't disappear. It got transferred, sold, picked up by someone with deeper pockets and longer reach, someone who could turn a gambling debt into leverage. Pull his jacket, Marcus said again, and check his saddlebags, every pocket, every compartment. Big Jim nodded and walked toward Tommy's bike. Marcus watched him go, then turned to look north toward the heart of Reno, where the casinos caught the morning sun and threw it back in blinding flashes of gold and glass. Raymond Loomis was out there somewhere. So was Dennis Pryor. And now possibly so was Tommy Nails, carrying information about their location, their numbers, their plans. The hunt had not ended at the diner. It had simply changed shape. Big Jim found the evidence in Tommy's left saddlebag stuffed into a sock at the bottom of the compartment. A prepaid phone, not Tommy's personal phone, but a second one, cheap and disposable, the kind you bought at a gas station for $20. Big Jim brought it to Marcus without a word and handed it over. Marcus scrolled through the call history. There were only 4 numbers in it, all outgoing, all placed within the last 24 hours. The most recent call had been made at 2:17 that morning, roughly 30 minutes before Tommy disappeared from his watch shift. Marcus did not recognize the numbers, but he did not need to. The pattern was enough. A prepaid phone, hidden in a saddlebag, calls made in the middle of the night while everyone else was sleeping. Tommy Nails had been reporting to someone, and that someone had been tracking their movements since the diner. The phishing phone explained how Dennis Pryor's men had appeared at the Desert Star diner so quickly. It explained how the suited man had known exactly where to look. And it explained something else that had been bothering Marcus since the ride, a dark SUV that he had spotted twice in his mirrors on the highway north, always maintaining the same distance, never closing, never falling back. He had dismissed it as coincidence. He would not make that mistake again. Marcus called the brothers together in the parking lot. 15 men formed a loose circle around him, their faces serious, their attention complete. Big Jim stood to Marcus's right with his arms folded. Tommy Nails is gone, Marcus said flatly. He had a burner phone in his saddlebag. 4 calls to unknown numbers in the last 24 hours. He was feeding information about our location and our movements to the people chasing this woman. The silence that followed was heavy and immediate. In the Iron Reapers, betrayal was not simply a breach of trust. It was an existential violation. The club existed because its members trusted each other with their lives, their freedom, and their safety. A brother who sold that trust did not just break a rule, he broke the foundation that everything else was built on. What do we do? Asked a biker named Ricky, a quiet man with a silver beard and steady hands. We ride, Marcus said. We get Eleanor to the FBI field office. We meet the journalist. And we end this today. Tommy burned us, but we still have the advantage. They don't know we found the phone. They think their man is still inside. He looked around the circle. From this point on, nobody rides alone. Nobody makes a call on a personal phone. And if anyone sees a black SUV, you signal immediately. He paused. This woman came to us for help. She trusted us. And I don't care what kind of suits or badges or money these people have, nobody takes her while we're standing. The bikers nodded, some quietly, some with the grim set of jaws that Marcus recognized from other moments in the club's long history, when the stakes had been high and the road ahead uncertain. These were not men who frightened easily, and they were not men who abandoned their own. Across the parking lot, Eleanor emerged from her room. She had changed into a dry blouse she had found in the motel's Lost and Found, and her white hair was combed back from her face. She looked small against the backdrop of motorcycles and leather and chrome, but she walked toward the group with a steadiness that had not been there the night before. I reached Megan, she said. She can meet us at noon. She has everything I sent her, and she's been working on it. She said the file, the encrypted file, the one with the names, it's bigger than we thought. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Bigger how? The payments to Judge Mercer weren't just for looking the other way on fraud cases, Eleanor said. Megan found connections to 3 federal land deals that went through Mercer's court over the last decade. Billions of dollars in government contracts for development on public land. The fraud isn't just about laundering money from private deals. It's about stealing public land and using the courts to make it legal. She looked around at the circle of bikers, men she had not known 24 hours ago. Men who by every visible measure should have been the last people on earth she would turn to for help. I know this isn't your fight, she said. I know you didn't ask for any of this, but I need to get to that FBI office, and I need to get there alive. Big Jim looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at Eleanor. The desert sun was warm on his face, and the sound of idling engines filled the morning air. Let's ride, Marcus said. They left the motel in formation. Marcus at the lead with Eleanor on the back of his bike. Big Jim riding shotgun on his left flank. Ricky covering the right. The rest of the Iron Reapers falling into position behind them in the staggered 2-column formation they had ridden 1,000 times before on highways across the American West. The ride into downtown Reno took 20 minutes. They cut through the morning traffic with the practiced ease of a convoy that knew how to move together, their engines rumbling in unison, drawing stares from pedestrians and commuters who pressed against their car windows to watch the procession pass. Eleanor sat behind Marcus with her arms around his waist and the hard drive tucked inside her coat. She watched the city slide past the casinos, the hotels, the office buildings catching the morning sun, the ordinary bustle of a Tuesday in a small western city that had no idea what was about to be dropped on its doorstep. The meeting with Megan Rowley was set for a coffee shop on South Virginia Street, a small independent place with outdoor tables and a view of the Truckee River. Marcus chose it for its visibility. Multiple sightlines open approaches hard for anyone to sneak up unnoticed. He stationed 4 bikers at various points around the block and kept Big Jim within shouting distance. Megan arrived at exactly noon. She was in her early 40s with sharp brown eyes and dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore jeans and a canvas jacket and carried a worn leather messenger bag over one shoulder. She moved quickly, scanning the street before entering the coffee shop, and Marcus recognized the cautious awareness of someone who had spent enough time investigating dangerous people to know that the dangers sometimes look back. She spotted Eleanor immediately and crossed the room in 3 strides. For a moment, the 2 women simply looked at each other, the 75-year-old widow who had been running for 8 months and the journalist who had been chasing the same story from the other side. Mrs. Graves, Megan said. Eleanor, please. They sat. Marcus took a position at the next table close enough to hear, but far enough to give them space. He ordered coffee he did not intend to drink and kept his eyes on the door. Megan opened her messenger bag and pulled out a laptop. I received your USB drive 3 weeks ago, she said. I've been working on it every day since, cross-referencing the financial records with public filings, court documents, and property registrations. She paused and looked directly at Eleanor. What your husband documented is extraordinary. It's the most comprehensive evidence of systematic corruption I've ever seen. Eleanor's expression did not change. She had already known this. She had known it since the night she first opened those files on her kitchen table in the house she had shared with Walter for 50 years, the house she could never return to. The encrypted file, Megan continued, lowering her voice, The one you opened last night. I need to tell you what I've found in it. She turned the laptop screen toward Eleanor. Marcus leaned slightly to see. The screen displayed a spreadsheet, names in one column, amounts in the next, dates in the third. At the top of the list in bold type was the name that Eleanor had already mentioned, Judge Franklin Mercer. Below it were others, Sheriff Dale Crenshaw, State Senator Richard Frey, Washoe County District Attorney Gene Aldridge, and several more. Elected officials, appointed judges, law enforcement officers at every level. 15 names, Megan said, all receiving regular payments from Holt Development Group through a network of shell companies over a period of 15 years. Total disbursements exceed $40 million. She closed the laptop and looked at Eleanor. This isn't just a story, Megan said. This is a case, a federal case, and when it breaks, it's going to take down people who have been in power for decades. Eleanor nodded slowly. That's what Walter wanted at the end. That's what he was trying to do before they killed him. Megan hesitated. Something shifted in her expression, a flicker of discomfort, a brief moment of the kind of reluctance that journalists learn to hide but never fully eliminate when they know the next thing they have to say will cause pain. Eleanor, Megan said carefully, there's something else in the files, something I need to show you before we go any further. Marcus felt the air in the room change. He straightened slightly in his chair. Megan opened the laptop again and navigated to a different section of the spreadsheet. She turned the screen toward Eleanor. The old woman stared at it. For a long moment she did not speak. She did not move. The color drained from her face so slowly and so completely that Marcus found himself half rising from his chair in case she collapsed. That's Walter's signature, Eleanor said finally. Her voice was barely audible. On those transfer authorizations, that's his handwriting. Megan nodded reluctantly. I checked it against his other documents in the files. It's a match. Walter authorized payments from Holt Development to several of the individuals on the list. Not just as an accountant processing transactions he didn't understand. He signed off on specific transfers to specific people. He knew who was getting paid and why. Eleanor stared at the screen. The spreadsheet blurred behind the tears gathering in her eyes. For how long, she whispered. Based on the dates, at least 12 years. 12 years. Eleanor's hand rose to her mouth. 12 years of signing documents that funded corruption. 12 years of knowing what the money was for and where it was going. 12 years of sitting across the dinner table from her and carrying a secret that would have destroyed everything she believed about him. He changed, Megan said quickly. The records show that 2 years before his death, Walter stopped signing. He began documenting instead of participating. That's when he started building the files he left for you. Something happened that made him switch from being part of the system to trying to expose it. He was diagnosed, Eleanor said, her voice flat and distant, 2 years before he died. Prostate cancer, stage 3. The doctor said he had time, but she trailed off. He knew the clock was running, and he couldn't carry it anymore. The coffee shop seemed to shrink around them. The ambient noise of other customers and clinking cups and the murmur of conversation faded into a distant hum that existed outside the small, devastating circle of truth that had formed around the table. He wasn't innocent, Eleanor said. Not a question, a statement. The kind of statement that cost everything to make. He wasn't, Megan agreed gently, but he chose to do the right thing at the end. And the evidence he collected, including evidence of his own involvement, is what makes this case unbreakable. A whistleblower who implicates himself is the most credible kind. Eleanor closed her eyes. Tears slipped down her cheeks in silent parallel lines. Marcus watched from the next table. He did not interrupt. He did not reach for comforting words because there were none that could touch this kind of pain. The pain of discovering that the person you loved most in the world was not the person you thought they were. That the foundation you had built your life on had cracks running through it that went all the way down to bedrock. He knew that pain. He carried his own version of it, different in its details, but identical in its weight. After a long moment, Eleanor opened her eyes. She wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand. She looked at the laptop screen one more time, at the signature that matched her husband's handwriting, at the numbers that told the story of his complicity and his redemption in the same cold columns of data. What do we do now? She asked. Megan looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at Eleanor. We go to the FBI, Marcus said. Today, right now. Megan nodded. I've already made contact with the field office. I have a meeting with a supervisory agent at 3 o'clock. If you're willing to come with me to bring the hard drive and your statement, this moves from a journalistic investigation to a federal case by tonight. Eleanor squared her shoulders. It was a small motion, almost imperceptible, but Marcus saw it clearly. The straightening of a spine that had been bending under the weight of grief and fear and revelation for 8 months. The decision made in the space of a single breath to keep going forward, regardless of what the truth had cost her. "I'll be there," Eleanor said. They left the coffee shop at 1:30. Marcus walked Eleanor back to his bike, while Megan headed to her car parked 2 blocks away. The plan was straightforward: regroup at the motel, organize the escort, and ride to the FBI field office at 2:30 for the 3 o'clock meeting. Marcus was strapping his helmet on when his phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. He answered it. "Mr. Dalton." The voice on the other end was calm, cultured, and completely unfamiliar. "My name is Raymond Loomis. I believe you have been spending time with a friend of mine." Marcus said nothing. He looked at Eleanor, who was watching him from the back of the bike with questioning eyes. "I'm not going to threaten you," Loomis continued. "Threats are the tools of people who have nothing else to offer. I have a great deal to offer, and I have a proposition for Mrs. Graves that I think she'll want to hear before she makes any decisions she can't take back." "She's not interested," Marcus said. "I think she will be," Loomis said, "especially when she learns the full truth about her husband. Not the version she's been constructing in her mind for 8 months. The real version, the one Walter never told her." Marcus felt a cold thread pull tight in his gut. "Tell your journalist friend to wait," Loomis said. "Give me 1 hour. If Mrs. Graves still wants to go to the FBI after she hears what I have to say, I won't stand in her way." "You have my word." "Your word," Marcus repeated flatly. "My word is the only currency that matters in this situation, Mr. Dalton. 1 hour, the Riverside Hotel on First Street. Room 714. I'll be alone." The line went dead. Marcus stared at the phone in his hand for a long moment. Every instinct in his body told him to ignore the call, get on the bike, and ride straight to the FBI. But the mention of Walter, the full truth, the real version, had landed exactly where it was intended to land. Not on Marcus, on Eleanor. He turned to face her. "That was Raymond Loomis," he said. Eleanor's face went white. "He wants to meet. 1 hour. He says he has information about Walter that you need to hear." Eleanor was quiet for a long time. The sounds of the city moved around them, traffic voices, the distant clatter of a construction site. She looked down at the hard drive inside her coat. Then she looked up at Marcus. "I need to know," she said. "Whatever it is, I need to hear it." Marcus studied her face. He saw the same determination he had seen in the diner, the same steel that had carried her through 8 months of running and hiding and surviving. But he also saw something else. A wound that Megan's revelation had torn open fresh and raw, and a desperate need to understand the full shape of the man she had spent 50 years loving. "Then we go," Marcus said, "but we go on our terms." He called Big Jim. Within 15 minutes, the Iron Reapers had repositioned. 4 bikers stationed at the Riverside Hotel's exits, 2 in the lobby. Big Jim and Ricky in the hallway outside room 714. Marcus and Eleanor would go in together. "If anything feels wrong," Marcus told her as they walked through the hotel lobby, "we leave, no discussion, no hesitation." Eleanor nodded. Her hand was inside her coat, resting on the hard drive. Her fingers were steady. They took the elevator to the 7th floor. The hallway was quiet, carpeted in muted burgundy, lit by brass wall sconces that gave the space a warm, artificial intimacy. Room 714 was at the far end. Marcus knocked once. The door opened, and for the first time, Eleanor Graves stood face to face with the man who had ordered her husband's murder. Raymond Loomis was 65 years old. He was not tall, not physically imposing, not the kind of man who filled a doorway or commanded a room through sheer presence. He was of medium build with thinning silver hair, combed neatly to one side, a clean-shaven face and pale blue eyes that held the focused, patient intensity of a man who had spent decades making very large decisions and living comfortably with the consequences. He wore a navy blazer over a white open-collared shirt. No tie, no rings, no watch. The simplicity was deliberate. Everything about Raymond Loomis was deliberate. "Mrs. Graves," he said, stepping aside to let them enter. "Thank you for coming." Eleanor did not speak. She walked into the room and stood near the window, positioning herself so that the light was behind her and her face was in shadow. Marcus took a position near the door, close enough to move quickly if necessary. Loomis sat in an armchair across from Eleanor and crossed one leg over the other. "I know what you think of me," he said calmly. "I know what your journalist has told you, and I know what you found on that hard drive." He paused. "But there are things on that drive that you haven't fully understood yet. Things about Walter that changed the story you've been telling yourself. Eleanor's voice was tight. Megan already showed me. I know Walter signed the transfer documents. I know he was part of it. You know a piece of it, Loomis said. You don't know all of it. He leaned forward slightly. Walter came to work for me in 1995. He was 43 years old. He was a good accountant and a better man than most. For the first 5 years, his work was entirely legitimate. But in 2000, I brought him into the inner circle because I needed someone I could trust with the financial architecture of the company's expansion. And Walter agreed. Loomis paused, letting the words settle. He didn't just sign documents, Mrs. Graves. He designed the system. The shell companies, the offshore accounts, the routing of funds through multiple jurisdictions, that was Walter's work. He was the architect. I provided the capital and the connections. Walter built the machine. Eleanor stared at him. The color had drained from her face again, but she did not look away. You're lying, she said. I have documentation, Loomis said. Emails, memos, handwritten notes in Walter's own handwriting, all of which I'm prepared to share with the FBI if you proceed with your plan. He spread his hands. I'm not telling you this to hurt you. I'm telling you because you deserve to know who your husband really was before you turn his legacy into a federal investigation that will expose him along with everyone else. The room was silent. Marcus watched Eleanor from across the space. She was standing very still, her hands clasped in front of her, the hard drive, a hard shape under her coat. What do you want? She asked finally. Loomis tilted his head. I want peace. I want this to end quietly. I'm offering you $2 million deposited in an account of your choosing in exchange for the hard drive and your silence. You can live the rest of your life in comfort and safety. No one will bother you again. He paused. Or you can go to the FBI, and when you do, everything will come out. Not just my crimes, Walter's crimes. His name will be in every headline. His reputation will be destroyed. And the woman who spent 50 years married to him will have to live with the public knowing that her husband was not a whistleblower. He was a co-conspirator who got cold feet at the end. Marcus felt his hands tighten at his sides. The calculation behind Loomis's offer was precise and ruthless. He was not threatening Eleanor with violence. He was threatening her with truth, the most devastating weapon of all. Eleanor stood at the window. Behind her, the Reno skyline glittered in the afternoon sun. Below, the Truckee River moved steadily through the city, indifferent to the human dramas playing out above its banks. She was quiet for a long time. My husband built your machine, she said finally, and then he tried to tear it down. That doesn't make him a hero, but it doesn't make your offer anything less than a bribe. She turned from the window and faced Loomis directly. Keep your money, she said. I'm going to the FBI. Loomis studied her for a moment. His expression did not change, but something shifted behind his eyes, a door closing, a calculation completing, a contingency being activated. I'm sorry to hear that, he said quietly. Marcus stepped forward. We're done here. They left the room without another word. In the hallway, Big Jim and Ricky fell into step beside them. The elevator descended in silence. In the lobby, the other bikers were waiting alert and ready. Marcus's phone buzzed as they stepped outside. A text from Big Jim's burner, black sedan, parked across street, 2 occupants, watching hotel entrance. They were being followed. Marcus did not look toward the sedan. He helped Eleanor onto the bike and fired up the engine. Change of plans, he called to Big Jim. We split the convoy. Half go to the FBI office as a decoy. We take the back roads. Big Jim nodded and began issuing orders. Within 2 minutes, the Iron Reapers had divided into 2 groups. 10 bikes roared north toward the federal building. Marcus with Eleanor turned south and slipped into the residential streets with Big Jim and 4 others as close escort. Behind them, the black sedan hesitated at the intersection, unsure which group to follow. By the time it made a decision, Marcus was already 3 blocks ahead and accelerating. His phone buzzed again. This time it was Megan Rowley. They have me, she said. Her voice was strained, controlled, but underneath the control was unmistakable fear. 2 men. They took me from my car outside the coffee shop. They have my laptop. They're driving north. Marcus's grip tightened on the handlebars. He felt Eleanor stiffen behind him. Where are they taking you? He asked. I don't know. A warehouse, I think, north of the city. They said if Eleanor doesn't hand over the hard drive by 6 o'clock tonight, they'll destroy everything. My laptop, my research, my sources. The line went dead. Marcus pulled to the side of the road. The other bikes pulled in behind him. He turned to Eleanor. They have Megan, he said. Eleanor's face was pale, but her eyes were clear. Then we need to move fast, she said. Get me to the FBI right now. I don't need Megan's laptop. I have the original. I have everything. She pulled the hard drive from inside her coat and held it up. Walter's legacy isn't on a journalist's laptop. It's right here, and it's going exactly where it needs to go. Marcus looked at her. 5 feet tall, 75 years old. Holding the most dangerous piece of evidence in the state of Nevada in her bare hands, with the same quiet ferocity of a woman who had decided finally and completely that she was done running. He nodded. Big Jim, he called. Take 3 brothers. Find Megan. Start at the industrial district north of town. Warehouses off Stead Boulevard. Big Jim's eyes hardened. And you? I'm taking Eleanor to the FBI alone. Like hell you are. They're watching for the convoy, Jim. 1 bike, 1 rider, 1 passenger. Nobody's going to look twice at that. Big Jim opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. He looked at Eleanor on the back of the bike, then at Marcus. Whatever he saw in his brother's face was enough. You're not alone, he said. You've never been alone. Then he turned, mounted his bike, and led his group north toward the industrial district. The engines roared and faded into the afternoon, leaving Marcus and Eleanor on a quiet residential street with the sun warm on their backs and the road to the FBI field office clear ahead of them. Marcus twisted the throttle. The Harley moved forward steady and sure. Behind them, the city hummed with the ordinary business of a Tuesday afternoon, unaware that a 75-year-old woman on the back of a motorcycle was about to bring it all crashing down. The ride from the quiet residential street to the FBI field office in downtown Reno should have taken 12 minutes. Marcus made it in 8. He cut through side streets and alleys, avoiding main intersections running amber lights where the traffic allowed, keeping the throttle steady and his eyes constantly moving between the road ahead and the mirrors behind. Eleanor held on without complaint, her arms locked around his waist, the hard drive pressed between her body and his back like a heartbeat caught between 2 sets of ribs. The FBI field office occupied the 3rd floor of a gray federal building on South Virginia Street, wedged between a Social Security office and an IRS satellite branch. It was not the kind of building that announced its importance. No grand columns, no flags snapping in the wind, just glass and concrete and the quiet institutional anonymity of a government facility designed to process paperwork and conduct interviews without attracting public attention. Marcus pulled the Harley into a space on the street directly in front of the building. He killed the engine and sat for a moment scanning the sidewalk and entrance, the cars parked along the block. Nothing out of place. No black SUVs. No men in dark jackets standing too still on corners. This is it, he said. Eleanor climbed off the bike slowly. Her legs were stiff from the ride and she steadied herself against the Harley's saddlebag for a moment before straightening. She pulled the hard drive from inside her coat and held it in both hands, looking down at it as if she were holding a letter she had been waiting her entire life to deliver. I need to do this alone, she said. Marcus frowned. I can walk you in, stand with you. Eleanor shook her head. You've done enough, more than enough. But this is between me and Walter. Between me and the truth. I need to walk in there on my own feet and hand this over with my own hands. She paused. If I let someone else carry it the last few steps, then I'll always wonder if I really did it myself. Marcus understood. He did not argue. He recognized in her the same thing he had seen in men and women throughout his life, who had reached the moment that mattered most and knew with a certainty that went beyond logic that they had to face it without anyone standing between them and whatever came next. I'll be right here, he said. Eleanor reached up and placed her hand on his arm. Her fingers were thin and cool against the leather of his sleeve. She looked up at him with eyes that were tired and grieving and resolved all at once. Thank you, Marcus, she said, for not looking away. Then she turned and walked toward the building. Her steps were slow but steady. Her back was straight. Her white hair caught the afternoon sunlight and glowed faintly against the gray concrete behind her. She looked in that moment like exactly what she was, a woman who had been afraid for a very long time and had decided at the end of a very long road that she was not going to be afraid anymore. Marcus watched her walk through the glass doors and disappear into the lobby. He did not move from the bike. He sat in the Nevada sun with his hands resting on his knees and his eyes on the building and waited. 14 minutes later, his phone rang. It was Big Jim. Found the warehouse, Big Jim said. His voice was tight, controlled, the way it always got when things had gone sideways but not yet resolved. Stead Boulevard. Old distribution center, looks like it's been empty for years. Loading dock on the east side, personnel door on the north. I count 2 men outside, one at the front when walking the perimeter, both carrying. Megan? Marcus asked. Can't confirm visually, but there's a white van parked inside the loading bay with its back doors open and lights on in what looks like an office on the second floor. Marcus gripped the phone. He could hear the faint idle of motorcycle engines in the background and the low murmur of Big Jim relaying positions to the other brothers. How do you want to play it? Marcus asked. Fast and loud, Big Jim said. These aren't soldiers. They're hired muscle working for a CEO, not a cartel. They signed up for intimidation, not a firefight with a dozen bikers. Do it. And Jim, she needs to be able to walk out of there. Copy. The line stayed open. Marcus heard Big Jim bark orders in a low voice, Ricky, take 2, and come around the loading dock from the south, wait for my signal. Everyone else on me through the front. Nobody throws the first punch unless they throw it at us, but if they throw it, you finish it. Then silence. The kind of silence that lasted 30 seconds but felt like 30 minutes where nothing happened and everything was about to happen, and the space between the two was charged with the electric tension of men preparing to move fast toward danger. The signal came as a sharp whistle, then noise, the heavy rhythmic thud of a steel door being kicked in, the crash of a lock giving way. Shouting, multiple voices overlapping the bikers' deep bellows, mixing with the startled yells of men who had been expecting a quiet evening of babysitting a kidnapped journalist and instead found a wall of leather and fury coming through their door. Marcus gripped the phone and listened. The sounds came through the speaker in fragments. Boots on concrete, the crack of something breaking a chair skidding across a floor, the sharp clatter of a metal object hitting the ground. Then a woman's scream, not pain, Marcus could tell, but the raw sound of surprise and sudden violent motion happening around someone who was restrained and unable to move. Then Big Jim's voice booming through the chaos like a foghorn cutting through fog. Nobody move. Hands where I can see them, on the ground, now. More scuffling. A grunt. The sound of a man being forced to the floor with considerably more enthusiasm than was strictly necessary. Then Ricky's voice, calmer, steadier. She's here, she's okay. Zip ties on her wrists, got a knife. The sounds of activity continued for another minute. The snap of zip ties being cut. Megan's voice saying something Marcus could not quite make out, the scrape and shuffle of 2 men being restrained with the same zip ties that had been used on the journalist. Then Big Jim was back on the line. Got her. She's shaken up. They roughed her around, some bruise on her face, wrists are raw, but she's walking and talking and mad as hell, which I take as a good sign. Laptop's here. Her bag's here. 2 of Loomis's men are on the floor enjoying our hospitality until someone with a badge shows up to take them off our hands. Marcus let out a long breath. Ricky called the feds. Already done. Agents are en route. Good. Get Megan to the Federal Building, South Virginia Street, 3rd floor. Eleanor's already inside. On our way. And Steele? Big Jim paused. That journalist is tougher than she looks. When we came through the door, she was trying to kick one of them in the knee with her hands tied behind her back. Remind me not to get on her bad side. Despite everything, Marcus felt the corner of his mouth lift slightly. Copy. Ride safe. Always. Marcus ended the call and slipped the phone into his vest pocket. He looked back at the glass doors of the Federal Building, their surface reflecting the afternoon sky and the tops of the buildings across the street. Eleanor was somewhere inside in a room he could not see, handing over the evidence that her husband had gathered and that she had protected through 8 months of fear and flight and solitude. Telling a story that would expose not just the men who had killed Walter, but Walter himself, his complicity, his guilt, his late desperate attempt at redemption. Marcus thought about that, about the weight of loving someone who turned out to be imperfect, about the courage it took to carry the truth about someone you loved into a room full of strangers and lay it on a table and say, here, this is what happened. All of it, including the parts that break my heart. He thought about Carol. 3 years ago in the hospital, 2 days before she died, Carol had taken his hand and told him something he had never expected to hear. Not a goodbye, not an expression of love, though there had been plenty of both in those final days. She had told him about an affair. 11 years earlier, a colleague at the school where she taught. It had lasted 4 months and ended badly, and she had carried the guilt of it like a stone in her pocket every day since. Marcus had sat in the hospital chair and felt the ground shift beneath him. The woman he had trusted more than anyone on earth, the woman whose love had been the one fixed point in a life of constant motion and uncertain loyalty, had looked at him from her hospital bed with dying eyes and told him that she had been unfaithful. He had not spoken for a long time. Carol had watched him with an expression that held no expectation of forgiveness, only the exhausted relief of a confession finally made. Why, he had asked, not why did you do it? Why are you telling me now? Because I don't want to die carrying it, she had said, and because you deserve to know who I really was, not the version you created, the real one. Marcus had held her hand through the silence that followed. He had not forgiven her immediately. He was not sure he ever fully had, but he had stayed. He had held her hand through the last 2 days and the last night, and the moment at the end when her breathing stopped and the room went quiet and the woman he loved became a memory. And in the months and years that followed, riding alone through deserts and mountains and empty highways, he had come to understand something that the pain had initially made impossible to see. Loving someone did not require them to be perfect. It required you to hold the whole truth of who they were, the good and the bad and the broken and the brave, and decide that the love was bigger than the disappointment. Carol had been unfaithful. She had also been kind and patient and strong, and the only person who had ever looked at Marcus Steele Dalton and seen someone worth staying for. Walter Graves had been complicit in a corrupt system for 12 years. He had also at the end risked everything to tear that system down. People were complicated. Love was complicated. And the only thing more difficult than carrying the truth was pretending it didn't exist. Marcus sat on his motorcycle in the Nevada sun and waited for Eleanor to emerge from the building where she was at that very moment, carrying the full truth of her husband's life into the light. Inside the FBI field office, Eleanor Graves sat at a gray metal table across from Supervisory Special Agent Patricia Stern. The room was small, windowless, and lit by the same pale fluorescent lights that seemed to exist in every government building in America. A digital recorder sat on the table between them. A second agent, a young woman with short hair and serious eyes, sat in the corner, taking notes on a laptop. Eleanor placed the hard drive on the table. "My name is Eleanor Graves," she said. "My husband was Walter Graves. He was murdered 8 months ago by people working for Raymond Loomis, the CEO of Holt Development Group. This hard drive contains evidence of a systematic fraud and corruption network involving hundreds of millions of dollars in fake real estate transactions, payments to federal and state officials, and the laundering of money through offshore accounts." She paused. "It also contains evidence of my husband's participation in that network. For 12 years, he helped build and maintain it. For the last 2 years of his life, he tried to document and expose it." She folded her hands on the table. "I am not here to present my husband as a hero. I am here to present the truth." Agent Stern studied her for a long moment. She was a woman in her early 50s, with the measured calm of someone who had conducted hundreds of interviews and had learned long ago to listen more than she spoke. "Mrs. Graves," she said, "do you understand that the evidence on this drive may result in charges being brought against individuals in positions of significant power?" "I understand." "And that it may also result in your husband's role being made public?" Eleanor met her eyes. "I understand that too." Stern nodded. She reached for the hard drive and placed it carefully beside the recorder. "Then let's begin." Eleanor talked for 3 hours. She started at the beginning. Walter's career at Holt Development, their life in a modest house outside Carson City, the gradual changes she had noticed in her husband over the years. She described the night he died, the phone call from the police, the funeral where Raymond Loomis had sent flowers with a card that read, "Deepest sympathies." She described finding the hard drive, understanding what it contained, and making the decision to run. She described the 8 months that followed, sleeping in her car, eating at truck stops, moving from town to town across Nevada, never staying more than 2 nights in the same place, learning to pay for everything in cash, learning to look over her shoulder constantly, learning to live in the kind of fear that became so constant it stopped feeling like fear and started feeling like weather, something you endured because you had no choice. She described the night at the Desert Star Diner, the headlights in the parking lot, the suited man at her table, and the massive biker in the corner booth who, when she whispered 6 desperate words, did not hesitate. Agent Stern listened to all of it. When Eleanor finished, the room was quiet for a long moment. "Mrs. Graves," Stern said, "based on what you've provided, I'm going to initiate an emergency investigation. I need to make some calls. I need you to stay in the building for your safety. Can you do that?" Eleanor nodded. And the journalist Megan Rowley, you said she has a copy of everything. She does. She's on her way here now. Stern stood. Good, this is going to move fast. By tonight we'll have warrants. She paused at the door. You're a brave woman, Mrs. Graves. Eleanor shook her head slowly. I'm a tired woman who made a promise to a man who ran out of time to keep his own. Megan Rowley arrived at the federal building 40 minutes later, escorted by Big Jim and two Iron Reapers, who had cleaned up enough to look marginally less alarming in a government lobby. She walked through the doors with a bruise darkening on her left cheek and raw red marks around both wrists, where the zip ties had been. But her eyes were sharp and her jaw was set with the fierce determination of a woman who had just survived something terrible and intended to make sure it meant something. She brought her laptop and the USB drive Eleanor had mailed from Ely. The FBI agents processed both, immediately pulling the files into their secure systems, while a forensic technician verified the integrity of the data. The evidence was staggering in its scope: thousands of pages of financial records, transaction logs, wire transfer confirmations, internal memos, and email correspondence, spanning nearly 2 decades of systematic corruption. By 5 o'clock that afternoon, the investigation was officially underway. 3 additional agents had been brought in from the Sacramento field office. A secure conference room on the 4th floor had been converted into a war room, its walls covered with printed timelines and organizational charts that mapped the connections between Holt Development Group and the web of officials who had been protecting it. By 6, arrest warrants had been issued for Raymond Loomis, Dennis Pryor, Sheriff Dale Crenshaw, Judge Franklin Mercer, State Senator Richard Frey, and District Attorney Gene Aldridge. The warrants were signed by a federal judge in San Francisco, a jurist who had no connection to the Ninth Circuit or to anyone named in Walter's files. Agent Stern had been careful about that. In a case where the corruption extended to the judiciary itself, the chain of authority had to be untouchable. By 7, FBI agents, in coordination with U.S. Marshals, had taken Raymond Loomis into custody at the Riverside Hotel. He was still in room 714 when they arrived, sitting in the same armchair where he had delivered his ultimatum to Eleanor hours earlier. According to the agents who made the arrest, Loomis did not resist. He did not speak. He simply stood and allowed himself to be handcuffed and walked out of the hotel with the same composed expression he had worn his entire adult life. The expression of a man who had always believed he was too important to be held accountable, and who was only now, in the sterile click of handcuffs closing around his wrists, beginning to understand that he was wrong. Dennis Pryor was arrested at a gas station on Interstate 80, 40 miles east of Reno. He was driving one of the black SUVs that had haunted Eleanor's journey from the very beginning. He had pulled in to refuel, apparently heading east toward Salt Lake City. When the marshals approached the vehicle, Pryor attempted to reach for his phone. He was restrained before his fingers touched the screen. In the SUV, agents found a briefcase containing $50,000 in cash and a one-way plane ticket to Grand Cayman. Sheriff Dale Crenshaw was taken from his home in a rural subdivision outside Fernley at 9:30 that evening. He was still wearing his uniform when the agents arrived, still carrying the phone he had used to send messages about Eleanor's location to Loomis's people. His wife stood in the doorway behind him as he was led to the waiting vehicle, her face a mask of confusion that would, in the coming days and weeks, slowly transform into something closer to comprehension and then to devastation. Judge Franklin Mercer proved the most difficult to locate. He was not at his home in the Collin Ranch neighborhood. He was not at his chambers in the federal courthouse. His clerk had not seen him since the previous afternoon, and his phone went directly to voicemail. For several tense hours, the possibility existed that Mercer had been warned that the network's tentacles had reached far enough to tip off even a federal judge before the authorities could close the net. It was a U.S. Marshal named Donna Krieger who found him. Working on a hunch, she had contacted the FAA and requested a list of all private flights departing from northern Nevada airfields that evening. At 11:40 p.m., she identified a chartered Gulfstream at a small airfield north of Reno, registered to a shell company that appeared in Walter Graves's files. The jet's engines were running when the marshals arrived. Mercer was on the tarmac 50 feet from the aircraft stairs, carrying a passport in one hand and a carry-on bag containing 2 changes of clothes and $300,000 in bearer bonds. The flight plan filed with the tower listed the destination as Mexico City. He was handcuffed under the wing of the plane. He would never board the jet engines, drowning out whatever he said to the agents as they led him away. The pilot, upon learning the nature of the situation, shut down the engines without being asked and cooperated fully. Tommy Nails Barker was found the following day. He had not gone far. The local police discovered him in a motel room in Sparks, 3 miles from the Silver Ridge Motor Lodge, where the Iron Reapers had stayed, sitting on the edge of the bed with an empty bottle and the vacant expression of a man who had run out of places to run. He was not arrested. He had not committed a crime that the police could charge, not yet. But his information led the FBI to 2 additional members of Loomis's organization who had been coordinating the surveillance of Eleanor since she first fled her home in Carson City 8 months earlier. The news broke the following morning. Megan Rowley's story went live at 6 a.m. on the front page of the Reno Gazette-Journal and simultaneously on 3 national news outlets that had been given advance access to the verified evidence. The headline read, "Federal Judge Sheriff CEO Arrested in Massive Corruption. Ring Public Land Fraud Exceeds $500 million." The subheadline was shorter but carried more weight. Widow of whistleblower accountant delivers evidence after 8 months on the run. The article was meticulous. Megan had spent the previous night working with the FBI's Public Affairs Office to ensure that every claim in the piece was supported by documented evidence. She named names. She cited dollar amounts. She traced the flow of money from Holt Development Group through shell companies in Delaware and Nevada to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland, and then back again through the pockets and bank accounts of the men who had been paid to look the other way while public land was stolen and public trust was betrayed. She also told Walter's story, not the sanitized version, not the heroic version, the true version, the version of a man who had participated in corruption for 12 years and then in the final chapter of his life had tried to undo the damage he had helped create. Megan wrote about Walter's complicity with the same unflinching honesty that she brought to the rest of the piece, because she understood, as Eleanor had come to understand, that the truth was only powerful if it was complete. By noon, the story had been picked up by every major news network in the country. Raymond Loomis's photograph appeared on television screens from coast to coast, alongside images of Judge Mercer, Sheriff Crenshaw, and the other officials named in Walter's files. Legal analysts dissected the charges. Political commentators debated the implications. The phrase Holt Development appeared in more headlines in a single day than it had in the previous 20 years combined. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, Eleanor Graves' name appeared not as a victim, not as a widow, but as the woman who had carried the truth across the Nevada desert and refused to let it die. Eleanor did not watch the news coverage. She spent the morning at the FBI field office finishing her statement and reviewing documents with Agent Stern. She answered every question that was asked of her, including the ones about Walter's role, without flinching and without apology. When she finally emerged from the building in the late afternoon, the sun was low in the sky, casting long golden shadows across the sidewalk and warming the concrete with the last heat of the day. Marcus was still there. He had been there all day, sitting on his Harley in the same spot where he had watched her walk through the glass doors 14 hours earlier. Big Jim had brought him coffee twice. Ricky had offered to relieve him. He had declined both. He had simply sat and watched and waited, the way he had waited for many things in his life, with patience and stillness, and the quiet conviction that some things were worth staying for. When Eleanor walked through the doors and saw him waiting, she stopped. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The distance between them, 20 feet of concrete sidewalk bathed in afternoon light, felt both vast and intimate, the way distance does between people who have shared something that cannot be adequately described in words. Eleanor walked toward him slowly. She looked exhausted. Her eyes were red. The lines on her face seemed deeper than they had the night before, etched by the weight of everything she had said and heard and carried and surrendered in the last 24 hours. But she was standing. She was walking. And there was something in her expression that had not been there when Marcus first saw her stumble through the door of the Desert Star Diner in the rain, a quietness that was not the absence of pain, but the presence of peace. The peace that comes when you have done the hardest thing you have ever done and discovered that you survived it. "It's done," she said. Marcus nodded. "I heard. They arrested Loomis and Mercer and Crenshaw, all of them. I heard that too." Eleanor stood in the sunlight and looked up at him. "Walter wasn't who I thought he was," she said. "Not completely, not in the way I believed for 50 years. Marcus was quiet. "But at the end," she continued, "he tried to make it right. He didn't finish, but he started, and I finished it for him." She paused. "That has to be enough." Marcus thought about Carol, about the confession in the hospital room, about the years since then spent writing and grieving and trying to reconcile the woman he had loved with the truth she had left behind. "It's enough," he said. Eleanor reached into the pocket of her coat, the same soaked wool coat she had been wearing when she walked into the diner the night before now, dried and wrinkled and carrying the invisible weight of everything that had happened since. She pulled out a small folded piece of paper and held it out to Marcus. "What's this?" he asked. "Walter's favorite poem," she said. "He kept a copy in his desk at work. I found it when I was cleaning out his office after the funeral. I've been carrying it ever since." Marcus took the paper but did not open it. He tucked it into the inner pocket of his vest next to his heart. "Thank you," he said, "not for the paper, for everything." Eleanor smiled. It was the first real smile Marcus had seen from her small, tired, but genuine. The smile of a woman who had walked through the worst night of her life and come out the other side with something intact. "You know," she said, "for a man who pretended to be my grandson for about 30 seconds in a diner, you turned out to be pretty good at the job." Marcus laughed. It was a low rumbling sound that surprised even him. He could not remember the last time he had laughed. "Grandsons look out for their grandmas," he said. Eleanor stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. She came up barely to his chest, and her thin arms could not reach all the way around his massive torso, but the embrace was fierce and tight, and carried the weight of gratitude and grief and the particular kind of love that forms between strangers who have walked through fire together and emerged on the other side. Marcus hugged her back gently, the way you hold something precious that you know you are about to let go. They stood like that for a long moment on the sidewalk in the fading afternoon light. Cars passed on the street. Pedestrians walked by without glancing twice. The ordinary world continued its ordinary business around them, unaware of the extraordinary thing that had happened in its midst. Then Eleanor stepped back. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and straightened her coat. "Agent Stern arranged a safe house for me," she said. "A deputy is going to take me there tonight. I'll be in protective custody until the trial." Marcus nodded. "You'll be all right." Eleanor looked at him with clear, steady eyes. "I've been running for 8 months. I walked into a diner full of strangers and asked the scariest-looking one to pretend he was family. I rode on the back of a motorcycle through a rainstorm at midnight. I listened to a man tell me my husband was not who I thought he was, and I walked into a federal building and told the truth anyway." She paused. "I think I'll be all right." A gray sedan pulled up to the curb. A young federal agent stepped out, opened the back door, and waited. Eleanor turned to Marcus one final time. "Goodbye, grandson," she said. "Goodbye, Grandma." She walked to the car, her steps steady and sure. She did not look back. The door closed. The sedan pulled away from the curb and merged into the evening traffic, its taillights growing smaller and smaller until they disappeared around a corner and were gone. Marcus stood alone on the sidewalk. The sun had dropped below the building line, and the first hints of evening violet were spreading across the sky. He could feel the warmth of the day fading from the concrete beneath his boots. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out the folded piece of paper Eleanor had given him. He opened it slowly. The handwriting was small and precise, the handwriting of an accountant, a man who dealt in numbers and exactness, and the careful recording of things that mattered. Marcus read the words once, then again, then folded the paper and returned it to his pocket. He would keep it, not because of what it said, but because of what it represented. The last private thought of a man who had done wrong and tried to do right and run out of time before the balance was settled. The kind of thing you carry not because it gives you answers, but because it reminds you that the questions matter. Before he left Reno, Marcus made one more stop. He had gotten the address from Agent Stern's assistant, a quiet woman who had overheard enough of Eleanor's testimony to understand the request without needing it explained. Mountain View Cemetery sat on a hillside on the eastern edge of Carson City, an hour south of Reno. Marcus rode alone. He had told Big Jim to take the brothers ahead to the memorial site for Bobby Tate and that he would catch up. Big Jim had looked at him with the particular expression of a man who understood that some rides needed to be taken alone and had asked no questions. The cemetery was quiet in the late afternoon light. Rows of granite headstones stretched across the green slope, their shadows lengthening as the sun moved toward the western mountains. Sprinklers ticked softly somewhere out of sight, and the air carried the faint, sweet smell of freshly cut grass. Marcus found Walter Graves's marker in section 14, row 7. It was a modest stone gray granite polished with simple lettering. Walter James Graves, beloved husband, 1952 to 2025. The grass around it was neatly trimmed and a small vase had been set into the base, though it held no flowers. Marcus stood before the stone with his hands at his sides. He did not know this man. He had never met him, never spoken to him, never shaken his hand. But in the last 24 hours, Walter Graves had become one of the most present figures in Marcus's life. A ghost whose choices had set everything in motion, whose secrets had nearly destroyed the woman he loved, and whose final act of courage had created a path that Eleanor had walked to its end. "Your wife finished what you started," Marcus said aloud. His voice was quiet, pitched for the grave and no one else. "She's stronger than you probably knew. Stronger than she probably knew." He paused. A bird called from somewhere in the tree and the trees that lined the cemetery's eastern fence. The sprinklers continued their quiet rhythm. "She knows about the money," Marcus continued, "about the years you were part of it. She knows all of it. And she carried it into that federal building and put it on the table anyway, because the truth mattered more than the story she wanted to believe." He shifted his weight. "That took more guts than anything I've ever seen. And I've seen a lot." He was quiet for a long time. The shadows stretched further across the grass. The sun touched the tops of the Sierra Nevada mountains to the west, painting them in shades of amber and rose. "I don't know if you deserve what she did for you," Marcus said finally, "but she did it, and that says more about her than anything else could." He reached into the inner pocket of his vest, pulled out the folded poem, and placed it on the base of the headstone beside the empty vase. "She wanted you to have this back," he said. Though that was not exactly true, Eleanor had given it to Marcus. But standing here in the quiet of the cemetery with the mountains turning gold behind him, it felt like the right place for it. The last private thought of a complicated man returned to the only place where it could finally rest. Marcus turned and walked back through the rows of headstones to where his Harley waited at the cemetery gate. He climbed on, started the engine, and sat for a moment listening to the deep, familiar rumble that had been the constant soundtrack of his life for 30 years. Then he pulled onto the highway and rode north toward the memorial for Bobby Tate, toward the brothers who were waiting toward whatever came next. Big Jim was waiting at the junction where Highway 395 met the road to the memorial site. He had parked his bike on the shoulder and was leaning against it with his arms folded, watching the road with the patience of a man who had spent his life waiting for other men to finish what they needed to finish before they could ride again. "She's something," Big Jim said as Marcus pulled alongside. Marcus nodded. He killed the engine and sat for a moment in the silence. "You good?" Big Jim asked, not prying, just checking. "Getting there." Big Jim accepted that. He did not ask where Marcus had been. He did not need to. "Boys are at the memorial site," Big Jim said, "waiting on us. Bobby's daughter even came down from Fresno. First time she's shown up for anything with the club in 10 years. Marcus thought about that. Bobby's daughter, who had kept her distance for so long, finally arriving. People coming together at the end. It seemed to be the theme of the week. "Let's not keep them waiting," Marcus said. Big Jim grinned. He swung his leg over his bike and fired the engine. The familiar roar filled the evening air, and Marcus brought his own machine to life beside it. Two engines, two brothers. The sound rolling across the empty highway like a conversation in a language that required no words. They rode together to the memorial site where the rest of the Iron Reapers were gathered in a clearing off a dirt road overlooking the desert valley below. 18 motorcycles parked in a semicircle, men standing together in the fading light, their leather vests catching the last gold of the sun. Bobby Tate's photograph had been placed on a flat rock in the center next to a bottle of bourbon and a pack of his favorite cigarettes. The ceremony was simple, as these things always were. Men who had ridden with Bobby told stories. Some were funny, some were not. Big Jim poured bourbon on the ground and said the words that the club always said for the fallen. Marcus stood at the edge of the circle and listened and remembered and let himself feel the weight of another loss in a lifetime that had held more than its share. But this time the weight felt different. Not lighter exactly, but distributed more evenly. Shared across shoulders that were no longer carrying it alone. When the ceremony was over and the bourbon was finished and the stories had all been told, Marcus walked to the edge of the clearing and looked out over the desert. The valley stretched below him, vast and ancient, painted in shades of purple and gold by the dying light. The mountains rose in the distance like sentinels guarding the edge of the visible world. The sky above was enormous, transitioning from amber to violet to the deep, infinite blue of approaching night. He thought about Bobby, who had ridden beside him for 15 years and would never ride again. He thought about Carol, who had loved him imperfectly and been loved imperfectly in return. He thought about Walter Graves, who had built a machine of corruption and then tried to tear it down with the same hands that had built it. And he thought about Eleanor, walking into a diner in the rain, walking into an FBI office in the sun, always walking toward the thing she feared most because walking away had stopped being an option a long time ago. Big Jim appeared beside him, ready. Marcus took one last look at the desert stretching out below him. The first stars were appearing faint and distant, like memories of light from a very long time ago. Yeah, he said, let's ride. The Iron Reapers mounted their bikes. The engines roared to life one by one, a deep rolling thunder that echoed off the mountains and filled the desert air with the sound of machines and brotherhood and the particular kind of freedom that came from having somewhere to go and people to go there with. Marcus opened the throttle and the Harley leapt forward, finding the highway like a horse finding its way home. He thought about Carol, about forgiveness, about the way love persisted even when it was complicated, even when it hurt, even when the person you loved turned out to be something other than what you had imagined. He thought about the folded piece of paper in his vest pocket, Walter Graves's favorite poem unread, but already carrying weight. He thought about Eleanor's voice in the diner, steady and fierce despite the trembling of her hands. He thought about what it cost to carry truth into a room full of strangers and lay it down like an offering, knowing it would change everything, knowing there was no taking it back. Behind him, the brothers fell into formation. The convoy moved north through the desert as the last light faded and the stars took over the sky. They passed through small towns where the lights of gas stations and diners glowed against the darkness like beacons on a dark sea. They rode past the places where ordinary people were living, ordinary lives unaware that a 75-year-old woman in a safe house in Reno had just changed the landscape of power in northern Nevada forever. The highway opened up ahead of them, straight and infinite, cutting through the dark landscape like a promise with no end. The stars were everywhere now, scattered across the black canvas above, in the kind of abundance that only the desert far from city lights could offer. Marcus rode at the head of the formation. The wind hit his face and the engine rumbled beneath him, and the brothers rode behind him in perfect practiced alignment. The road was clear and the night was deep, and somewhere far behind them an old woman was sitting in a quiet room, finally still, finally safe, finally able to stop running. And somewhere inside Marcus Dalton, in the place where grief had lived for 3 years, like a tenant who refused to leave, something shifted. Not vanished, not healed, but shifted, made room, opened a window in a house that had been closed for too long, and let the desert air come in. He did not know if what he felt was peace. He was not sure he would recognize peace if it sat down across from him in a diner booth, but he knew it was something that had not been there yesterday. Something that the night and the rain and the woman and the ride had shaken loose from a place deep inside him where he had stopped looking. The convoy thundered north through the Nevada desert. The stars burned overhead in their ancient patterns. The road stretched ahead, endless and dark and full of the kind of promise that only people who have been lost can truly appreciate. Marcus Dalton rode into the night, and for the first time in a very long time, he was not riding away from something. He was riding toward it,